All right, back to work we go. So this is part 2 of our afternoon general session. This is the international panel. I'd like to welcome our guests this afternoon. Carlos Casasús is Director General of CUDI, the private nonprofit corporation that manages the National Research and Education Network in Mexico. Carlos served as the first chairman of COFETEL, the Mexican counterpart to the Federal Communications Commission, and prior to that he served as Undersecretary for Communications and Technology Development in Mexico's Ministry of Communications and Transportation. Current CUDI members include leading research universities and research centers, as well as companies that support research and education in Mexico. Also with us this afternoon is Julio Ibarra, is the Assistant Vice President for Technology Augmented Research at Florida International University. He's responsible for furthering the mission of the Center for Internet Augmented Research and Assessment to contribute to the pace and quality of research at Florida International University through the application of advanced cyber infrastructure. And someone who should not be, who should be absolutely familiar to most of us here at CENIC is our dear friend and colleague, John Silvester, who's the Vice Provost of Scholarly Technology and Professor of Electrical Engineering at the University of Southern California. His current research interests are traffic modeling, high-speed networks, and wireless packet networks. Again, our panel this afternoon will be moderated by our CEO, Louis. So take it away, Louis.
So those of you who were in the last session, we're going to follow a similar pattern where our panelists are going to get up and talk about what's going on in their particular contexts. As you may know, CENIC has had a pretty long-term commitment to partnering internationally. Along with the Pacific Northwest Gigapop, we run Pacificwave, which is a West Coast peering fabric, and as you heard in the last session, if you were here, we're hoping to extend that to British Columbia. We partner with Florida International on the connection, the West Coast connection to Carlos and CUDI, and are looking at, and that's an NSF funded project. Similarly, we partner with the University of Hawaii and their partners at ARNet, the Australian Research and Education Network, to connect Australia and Hawaii with trans-Pacific submarine cable fiber. In some ways, that's a precursor to having robust connectivity to Australia as part of the square-kilometer array of radio telescopes. It's coming online in a few years, but right now supports a lot of different research interests. We have a pretty active international research community in California. And quite honestly, I think we've barely scratched the surface of what's possible in the educational arena, whether we're talking about K-12 or community colleges or CSUs or UCs, the private institutions, about what might be done in terms of using this capacity to help develop and sustain education and research partnerships for our students as well as our faculty across California. So I think we're really at the beginning of a suite of activities that have great opportunity to continue to flourish. So with that, I don't know what the order is. Carlos, are you? Okay. Julio, you're up first, I guess.
Louis, can you help me out here with this?
Yeah.
Just... Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Maybe I should just, okay. So I'm going to start us off. My name is Julio Ibarra, and I'm the principal investigator for a project that Louis mentioned, the AmLight project, America's Light Paths. And I'm one of a team here. Heidi Alvarez, also from FIU, she's in the back, co-PI. Donald Cox is a co-PI, and Louis Fox is also co-PI on our project here that's funded by the National Science Foundation and also by collaborators in Latin America, in particular Brazil. I briefly want to say that I've been working with CENIC for quite a few years. Started with our initial project involving connectivity between the U.S. and Latin America, and Tom West was the CEO at that time, then succeeded by Jim Dolganas. And we now have another 5-year cooperative agreement with the NSF that started in 2010. And Louis, you came in and pretty much came in running, and it's been great having you as part of the team as well, working on these international collaborations. So my talk today is going to provide you with an update on a recent workshop that was conducted that focuses on one of the network connections between the U.S. and Mexico, the one from California to Mexico, and tell you a little bit about how that evolved as well. So here is the outline of my talk. Give you some background to the cross-border collaborations we have in the AmLight project, show you some geography as well with the links that we have as part of this project, the US-Mexico 10 gig network link, and then a little bit of information about the workshop that we conducted last year and the second one that was conducted this year in February at UCSD. So a little bit of background about the AmLight project. It's an NSF project in the International Research Network Connections Program. It is a project that mostly funds bandwidth and connectivity across the continents and also North America. Its goal is to enhance science research and education in the Americas by operating international network connections with our partners in different countries. Mexico is one of our partners, as well as Brazil. The idea is to engage researchers in the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere in engineering research and education, build and operate transcontinental test beds for network experimentation, and also use this infrastructure as an open instrument for collaboration. Here you see a list of the collaborating organizations for the AmLight project. CENIC is one of them, so is CUDI, and a number of organizations in Latin America, along with the NSF, FIU, and others. This shows you a topology diagram of the connections that we have connecting the continents. There's 4 10 gigabit circuits that connect the U.S. from Miami to South America, terminating in Sao Paulo, and also with add drops in Santiago, Chile. We have a 10 gigabit connection, which is going to be the focus of my talk, between San Diego, Tijuana, with also an extension to Los Angeles, where it meets with Pacificwave for international peering, and extended to Ensenada, which was a component of CUDI and CICESE to provide that extension. And there's also a 1 gigabit connection from San Antonio to Mexico City that is managed by the Texas Regional Network LEARN. So let me focus now on the US-Mexico 10 gigabit network link. So this link was established back in 2012, and it's operated by CENIC and CUDI, and also CICESE. And support is provided by the AmLite project, CENIC, CUDI, and CICESE. And what are the main science drivers for the upgrade? Because initially it started as 2 1 gigabit links, and it was later upgraded to 10 gigabits. The science driver was the OptiPortal project that was started at UCSD, and there was a collaboration with CICESE and Ensenada, and this is a high bandwidth big data type of resource, and so this is part of what we're supporting. And one of the things that we wanted to see about doing was to attract more big data types of applications to use this network infrastructure. So the research question that we posed to our community was, how do we go about enhancing existing or to form new cross-border networks of collaboration between researchers and students connected by the US-Mexico 10 gigabit per second link? Larry Smar, Louis Fox, myself, Carlos, a number of us got together, brainstormed this, and we thought that a workshop would be a useful mechanism by which to broaden information, or disseminate information to a broader community of researchers that already were doing work with Mexico, and see how we can attract them to start to make use of this connection. So a workshop was organized and held in Ensenada, Mexico in October, and it was called Big Data, Big Networks, a workshop funded by the National Science Foundation through the AmLite project, hosted by CICESE in Ensenada. And these were the objectives of the workshop, primarily to understand the challenges of conducting cross-border science research collaborations that were supported through a research network, to foster and create an environment that will stimulate discussion and facilitate knowledge sharing between the researchers in the US and Mexico, and see how we can focus on understanding their issues of cross-border collaboration, and see how the network can help in solving some of those issues. And then also to identify some short-term and long-term opportunities for stimulating more network-enabled work. The NSF funded this workshop along with support from CICESE, and what we ended up doing was then putting out a call for abstracts. And we received 23 abstracts, and we had a program committee with a number of people from Mexico and the US. There's a few people here. Cliff Frost was on the committee, so was Janice and Louis, Heidi, Carlos, a few others as well. And we organized these abstracts into these themes that you see here, 7 different themes. And there's a URL there for the website that provides you with more information about this. But essentially we developed the whole workshop based on these themes. And from these themes, we then collected a number of, quite a bit of data from the presentations that were given by the researchers that participated from the US and Mexico. And you see here on the left corner 3 dimensions on the challenges, the cyber infrastructure requirements, and actionable objectives that we organized this data around, and the 7 different themes on the top set of columns. So this will be what we'll use then to provide some recommendations, and this will be within a report that will go to the funding agencies here in the US, the National Science Foundation, and also in Mexico, to see about obtaining further funding to stimulate more of this cross-border collaboration. These are the workshop participants. a photo that we took there at the CICESE campus in Ensenada. Now, as a follow-up, a second workshop was held in February of this year at UCSD. And we had a number of the same researchers that participated in the first one, as well as some new ones that came to this second workshop. And the idea was pretty much the same, but this workshop focused more on providing information and training opportunities to the users and how to use some of the technology that was available already connected to the 10 gigabit connection. Cal IT2 hosted this, the technology was there, and we had some very nice demonstrations and some training opportunities as well for the participants. I want to take the opportunity as well here to thank a number of organizations and people that made this possible. First, the NSF with their generous grant for the workshop. Larry Smar for his leadership. We had some very good keynote speakers, Tom DeFonte at UCSD and Federico Graf of CICESE. Our speakers, which if you go to the website, you can see all who were the speakers for the workshop. Our program committee, want to thank Janice as well again for a lot of her help and help with the report. And then our stakeholders with CENIC, CUDI, CICESE, and Cal IT2. Questions now or later?
Why don't we'll save them and we'll have questions at the end.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Is that your computer here, Carlos?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It's not my computer, but my slides.
Your slides and a connection for you.
Ooh, I need a password.
He needs a password for the desktop. Let me.
Yeah. We turned it off. We shouldn't.
There you go.
Oh, more. Or turn it off. This, right. We don't need it, right?
Right.
Okay.
Here, let me start that for you.
So, thank you for inviting me. And I've had the opportunity to be several times in CENIC telling about the tough path, no, to get better connectivity in Mexico. But I think we're advancing importantly, no? We have now been able to undertake several projects that come from different funding sources. In the past 2 or 3 years, we have been working with the Ministry of Communications in the development of a network that's built on top of the Electricity Commission fiber. The Electricity Commission is the monopoly government-owned provider of electricity in Mexico, and they have a significant deployment of fiber throughout Mexico. It's becoming a mainstay of the digital development policies of Mexico to make this fiber more easily available for different sets of users. The Mexican government is probably going to announce pretty soon plan that was contemplated in the constitutional reforms of the telecommunications sector that were passed last year. No, the implementation of the reform is slower than I expected, but it will eventually come forward. No, and the Mexican government is doing a significant effort to improve connectivity throughout Mexico. For the CUDI network, we have access to this infrastructure in the 40 most important cities of the country, no? Basically all the state capitals plus the border areas. And in each of these nodes, we have an access point in one of the Electricity Commission hotels. And this infrastructure has been in place now for a bit more than a year. And the problem is how to get last mile connectivity into the university campuses. And we got some funding from the Mexican Congress to build at least one fiber connection, dark fiber connection, to each of the state university campus in each of these 40 cities. No? So this helps a lot because in those nodes we can eventually start putting radio links, high capacity radio links, to connect other universities in every city. This infrastructure is now coming on stream. We were able also to buy a significant number of routers to deploy in those 40 cities. And we are now have an spaghetti bowl that's looking pretty filled. So I would like to point out a couple of issues here. The Electricity Commission fiber on the west coast of Mexico does not get up all the way to Tijuana. No? So the Tijuana link that Julio mentioned for a 10 gigabit connection basically benefits only the Baja Peninsula at this moment. So we have the main path of connection to the United States through El Paso and Ciudad Juárez, no? But let's say the traffic from the West Coast that goes to California has to come down to Guadalajara and Monterrey and go back to El Paso in order to get back to. So it's not a very efficient configuration. And we think that with relatively little resources going forward, we could improve significantly the operational topology of the network so that we can implement a better network. No? As Julio mentioned, we had the two workshops which I found really important and really entertaining to work on those projects. The first one was in October, the second one was in February. The first one that took place in Ensenada brought a whole series of themes. No, Julio already mentioned some of them, but I believe there are tremendous opportunities for collaborative science between Mexico and California. No, we talk about Science Gateway, digital media, oceanography, nanomaterials, bioinformatics, seismography. Important areas like, for example, the San Pedro Martyr observatory that is it's one of the best astronomical sites in the world. No, it's very a very clear site at night, and it has it's very remote. No, so it's not contaminated by light like in Hawaii. Probably a center that could be developed into a major astronomical site in the next few years. That should certainly be able to take advantage of this better connectivity. I'm sure that in the next few years we will see a pretty significant number of telescopes go up in San Pedro Martyr. In the La Jolla workshop, we saw the possibilities of the display technologies that were presented, and all sorts of opportunities in even trade optimization or disaster responses. No? What I find important is that we've made the commitment to hold these workshops on a continuous basis. No? Even though the following workshops will not probably be as spectacular as the first, getting more people involved, getting the resources, getting the human network working, I think has been a very, very important experience for the development of collaborative science. Basically, as we improve the connectivity, I think this type of applications can be brought not only to California or to the Californias as presently, but hopefully we should be able to connect with the bigger science nodes in Mexico, which are the larger cities. No? Mexico City probably has 50–60% of the whole science budget throughout Mexico is in Mexico City, and connectivity, regretfully, is not as good as in Ensenada. No? But we should eventually get there and get these types of collaborations. Just to finish, I think there is a very high level interest today in collaboration pushed by the multiple summit meetings that President Obama and President Peña Nieto have been having. The latest one last month in Toluca, and well, the hard themes are drugs and immigration, but there are many other aspects. Among them, the idea of promoting joint research, and the idea of having student interchange, a much stronger student interchange between Mexico and the United States. One of the announcements is that Mexico will be sending 100,000 students to the United States to higher education. I mean, this is going to be a huge undertaking, probably very expensive. I don't know the programs, but certainly my perception is that networking is much more efficient than sending students. No? So I hope that we can put better networks between our universities and increase the collaboration with many, many more institutions than presently. As a sign of this, just last week, there was an event in UC San Diego called Mexico Moving Forward, in which basically they had a very good conference on the 20 years of NAFTA, no? And it's really very impressive, the integration of the Mexican and U.S. economy, especially along the border region, has really been dramatic. No? The numbers of cross-border trade have increased dramatically. The number of industrial sectors that have been affected by NAFTA is really amazing. No, certainly Mexico is becoming a powerhouse in automotive assembly, in aeronautical assembly and manufacturing, and electronics. No, I mean, there are a whole series of industries that now depend on a much better relationship between the United States and Mexico, on the infrastructure that we have put in place. And basically, Janet Napolitano, the new president of the University of California, made an announcement that the University of California will launch a Mexico initiative, no, as a general theme, no, of having a much closer collaboration between the university and Mexico. No? She recently, I mean, the quote I have is from the remarks to the Board of Regents of the University of California, basically mentioning that Mexico will be a priority for the University of California. But the same type of efforts should come also from all the universities along the Mexican border, where a closer collaboration and research on the border is certainly going to be more and more important. I'm quite optimistic that we will be able to do great apps and great networking in the following years. Thank you.
Oh, this is bolted on.
Bolted on?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Well, that's interesting.
Somebody tightened the bolts. Decided we have to be all Mac users.
Technologist does it take too.
Yeah. How about we unscrew these things?
There you go. That's what I was looking for. Just the magic screws. What would we do without you, Lewis? Great.
There
Thanks.
you go.
Okay, so first off, I'd like to say that I was formerly a vice provost of scholarly technology at USC. I'm currently not, but that's okay. I'm doing other things. So I'm actually a professor in the School of Engineering, as was mentioned, but I've been working in the international arena with CENIC for many years, as many as you know, and so I wanted to just give an overview, a brief update, really, of some of the other activities that CENIC's involved with, primarily through Pacificwave. As you know, California only has 2 international frontiers, right? One is with Mexico, and we've heard all about the connections to Mexico. And the other one is with the other 49 states, directly or indirectly. No, seriously. We only have one international border, and this is why there is a lot of focus on activities with Mexico and as our neighbor, and one that we can actually put fiber across the border and get very good connectivity. And I think there are huge opportunities there to develop interesting relationships with all our institutions. So I look forward to that. Otherwise, we sort of have to cross oceans or the rest of the US to get to other international partners. As you know, this is one of the reasons that CENIC's been very active in the operation of Pacificwave, which has been mentioned a few times already in this session today. So many of you may have know quite a lot about Pacificwave. Some of you are perhaps newer to the game, so I thought this would be useful for us to just go through that fairly quickly. This is the pacificwave.net website. I encourage you to take a look at it, and it describes quite a bit about who the participants in Pacificwave with. I'll give an overview of that in a minute. And this nice little graphic here, which sort of represents the connectivity that we have access to through Pacificwave. So Pacificwave is a series of interconnected exchange points on the West Coast in the US, 2 of them being in California and 1 being in the state of Washington in Seattle. And as was mentioned earlier, with sort of extensions of that into Mexico now and the potential for extensions into Canada with BCNet as well. So these are largely the sort of red lines that you see on the west coast of the US there. And we have very good connectivity up and down the west coast, right? So we have 100 gig connections between the Pacificwave sites. So that gives us a lot of opportunities there. And then at those key exchange points, many of the international networks come together, and many of the domestic, US domestic research and education networks meet together in those points to exchange traffic. And this has been in operation for, actually, I don't know exactly how long. Celeste, how long has it been in operation? Or anybody remember how long it's been? Longer than I can remember. Yeah, but it sort of predated that a little bit too in terms of the exchange points that were in operation, I think. Anyway, at least, so from 1996 onwards, we've sort of been in this business. I want to point out Celeste is very helpful in putting together some of the notes here, and she's very active in the operation of the exchange points, working with CENIC and the University of Southern California. So, and then you see some of the other branches that are coming out of this, and the green lines sort of represent the key countries that are linked into these exchange points. And so we sort of land pretty much everywhere. We don't land. Everywhere in Asia sort of lands upon these exchange points, which allows for a lot of collaborations between certainly California institutions, but all US institutions, in fact, with Asia. The other key components in here, shown in red, is Australia. And again, this was mentioned earlier before. This was the basis for a NSF IRNC program to work with Australia for landing of these 2 important research links from Australia to the US, and that's been going on for about 10 years as well. They come through Hawaii and land in Los Angeles, roughly, and Seattle. A little more about those later. So this is the set of participants that we have, and in terms of international, foreign, and US domestic networks. ARNet, the Australian network, Canadian network, CENIC, we ourselves obviously are participants in the exchange. CERNET, that's the Chinese Education and Research Network. CLARA, the Latin American network. CUDI, specifically the Mexican network we heard about earlier. DREN, Defense Research and Engineering Network. ESNet, Energy Sciences Network. Again, several of the important federal research networks connect into our exchange points. GEMNet, this is one of the international research networks from Japan. There's more than one. Gloriad, the global ring for advanced applications. And development. Google should have been on a separate bullet. Sort of got crunched there. Sorry about that, in connections with Google. Internet 2, obviously. Another one of the Japanese research networks, the JGNX, which is funded by the NICT. Karen, that's the New Zealand network. KISTI, the Korean network. Los which is a regional network in the LA area. Microsoft Corporation, another one of the Japanese research networks, SciNet, NASA, and so on. It goes on. Nordunet, we have connections with the Nordic infrastructure for research and education, so it sort of links all the way through Chicago back to the Nordic countries. The National University of Singapore maintains its own direct connection to us. And Pacific Northwest Gigapop, being the partners in the state of Washington, in the Seattle area. The Qatar Foundation, SoftBank Telecom, this is a Japanese network as well. And Transpac, whichever version of it is, Transpac 1, 2, or 3, which does a lot of the connectivity to Japan also from the US side, and also other places reaching out into Asia. And the Taiwan Research and Education Network, TWAREN, and Ultralight, which is a sort of more a project than an international country. So as you can see, there's a pretty large set of international participants that connect into the exchange point, so they're pretty critical, and that's why CENIC has continued to be involved in the operation of these for many years. And by virtue of that, the folks that run the exchange points have a lot of technical interactions with their counterparts in all of these research networks that we're talking about here. So they've established very good relationships with the technical staff in the research networks in all these other countries, and also to a certain extent with the science researchers as well, but less so with that, since we don't tend to have the opportunity for the kinds of conferences that you were talking about with Mexico. It's a little harder to do with Asia, to have a sort of joint technical and research conference to bring the right people together. It's a little bit difficult to do that. It's expensive for a start, and it's just harder to do. We did a few experimental workshops with the Australians when we first had that National Science Foundation project called DIRCAP, driving e-research across the Pacific, and e-research capabilities across the Pacific. And they were successful, identifying a lot of potentials for collaboration, a lot of what some of the issues were, and one suspects that the researchers continue to develop those relationships. But the funding to support those sort of went away, and so they weren't continued. But I think there are perhaps some opportunities to think about how we might engage that again, to try and think it again as we're going into a new era of networking, the kinds of things that are capable, that it's possible now to do as we're upgrading from 10 gig to 100 gig with the different kinds of SDN we were hearing about earlier, those kind of capabilities. Perhaps we need to re-engage with our partners in the Pacific region in some fashion. We might think about how to do that. So let's give me just a few updates to mention here in case people aren't familiar. The Australian networks started out as 10 gig networks, and recently they're in the process of being upgraded. It became feasible to do faster than 10 gig, at least, across the Pacific. They wanted to go to 100 immediately, but it wasn't quite economically feasible, or at least there wasn't the market perhaps for it for the carrier involved. And so they upgraded to 40 gigabit. So the trans-Pacific links were upgraded to 40 gigabit, and the northern one, which lands in Seattle, now drops into 100 gig port in the switch, and the southern one will be upgraded soon. It's in the process of being upgraded, so that will also be coming into 100 gig port in LA. Similarly, CENIC's working through the connections with ESNet and Internet 2 to upgrade the ports to 100 gig for the connectivity there. DRAN recently upgraded to 10 gig in LA and Seattle as part of their DRAN 3 project. And most of the partners that we talk to in Asia are thinking about upgrading to 100 gig in the next few years, is the right way to say it. And precisely when it happens obviously depends on when the particular carriers they're working with decide to upgrade their infrastructure to provide 100 gig at a reasonable cost, and also to get funding from their ministries and various agencies that support them to allow it. But we can anticipate, I think, 2015-16 as being when we'll start to see a lot of activity there in terms of upgrade from 10 to 100 gig. Perhaps 2016, 2017, depending on funding and so on. So things are starting to move there, and we'll see pretty significant changes, I believe. As a sidelight, one of the things that came out of the Translite Pacificwave project and some of the other IR&C projects, there's always a big focus from NSF to be measuring the networks that they're deploying. They want to be able to demonstrate back to Congress, obviously, that they're investing their money wisely and that they're getting increases in performance, increases in collaboration and things like this. So they pushed quite hard for the projects, and they continue to, I believe, to implement a decent measurement infrastructure. And one of the things that grew out of that was a lot of the participants implemented perf sonar capabilities. And CENIC has sort of hosted or coordinated a perf sonar club, which is members that participate in this Pacificwave exchange and other interested parties get together on a regular basis to talk about their deployments of perf sonar, how they can work together. And I have a list in a moment of the participants in the perf sonar club. It's really grown to quite a significant group, and there's now quite a decent infrastructure to do some measurement in this network infrastructure that we're looking at. They currently use sort of PC-sized servers, small server-sized boxes to run the perf sonar equipment, but they're looking at can they get away with using some smaller form factor, cheaper devices that you can sort of scatter around to more places in the network to get additional measurements. And where they've been working particularly with RMP in Brazil and in testing out some of these different platforms, looking at the QBox and the Raspberry Pi and things like that as potentials to expand the measurement infrastructure. This is the set of participants in the TLPW Perfsana Perf Club participants. I listed it as sort of a set of networks that are participating in that, and most of those, as you see, are participants in the exchange, the Pacificwave exchange, and the set of institutions that are sort of actively engaged, at least in conversations, and to a certain extent in participation in developing the measurement infrastructure. And again, Celeste is a very good contact point if you want to find out more about the Perfsana. I should have put your email address in here, Celeste. Finally, what's Pacificwave doing with this, software-defined networking and Genie-type projects? There's a lot going on, but it's on a very sort of small-scale basis at the moment, on a sort of one-off type projects. Particular partners want to try out some different things, and that's sort of the stage that it is in terms of internationally across the Pacific. There's a lot more going on domestically in the US, obviously, certainly with Genie. But so there's some private interconnects that are experimenting with different software suites and things like that, both related to Genie and looking at using software-defined networking. But there isn't any sort of large-scale deployment of software-defined networking through the exchange points at this point in time. I would anticipate seeing that in the next year or so, and a serious consideration of OSCAs to do the provisioning for that. But again, it hasn't really been rolled out yet, but I think it's one of the things you'll see in the next year or two. Finally, just to give you an idea of activity, let's see if this works. Current activity on Pacificwave. This is a place you can go. This is the main Pacificwave website, right? And if you scroll down here under About Technology, there's a measurement. So you can always go and take a look at this and see what's going on. And you can have a look at what is the current traffic that's being carried across the infrastructure. Let's look at aggregating across all Pacificwave nodes. So this is looking at the LA exchange point, Sunnyvale exchange point, and the Seattle exchange point. This is something that Pacific Northwest Gigapop put together. You may have seen this before. And it just says that the current traffic coming into and egressing from the Pacificwave, if you draw a circle around, or an ellipse around those three sites, is the traffic coming in and going out. So it's sort of 28 gigabits per second inbound and 29 gigabits per second outbound. It's kind of a slow time in the day, it's getting late, so it's slowing down a bit. It was over 30, close to 40 earlier this afternoon, and this is updated dynamically. Kind of a fun thing to look at. And I lost my... The other... oh, sorry, I'll just go back. So that was looking at the overall set of exchange points of Pacificwave. This is looking at just the California piece. And this is where we get something. Oh, yes. So it's averaging between 11 to 12 gigabits per second coming into and out of just the California Pacificwave. That's to say the two exchange points in Sunnyvale and Los Angeles. And people are obviously starting to go home for a couple of beers on the way home, and it's sort of dropping down. No, this is the current traffic there. Finally, just looking at it historically, there's also this this data available there, and of course it's not going to work. I was trying to use this afternoon. I couldn't get it to work. For some reason, it's either being very slow to respond or it's not responding. So we have backup pictures. So this is the 1 year sort of retrospective on the traffic. So this is the total Pacificwave traffic over the last year, and it started out the year, you can see it was sort of averaging around 10 gig or maybe a little bit more inbound and outbound, and you can see since the middle of the fall semester, right, sort of November, not counting the New Year's period, Christmas, New Year's period, we see the traffic starting to grow fairly significantly, and it's now peaking out at sort of 30 gig in and out over whatever window this is being sampled. And so we're starting to see significant growth, continued significant growth of the amount of traffic that's being carried. And here's the corresponding picture for 5 years. It's like, we love these pictures. Everything's booming, right? And so what happened? When you say, what on earth happened on July 15, or sort of between August and September in this was the year before last. Well, it's not quite an accurate figure of what was really going on. It meant that a bunch of additional ports were added into the set of data that we were collecting. So. Right. So, but I think it certainly, if you look at what's happened from the sort of leftmost side of the picture to the discontinuity, it was steadily growing, and since the discontinuity, it's also continues to grow, and it's actually picked up speed quite a bit this year. In January and February, March, the first quarter of this year. So we're still seeing very significant growth in the use of this infrastructure, clearly a critical infrastructure. And as we continue to see more and more 100 gig connections come in, this is going to go up probably by an order of magnitude in the next few years. We won't do it obviously in 1 year unless we have another discontinuity like that. But so that's where we are. Anyway, so you can see it's a very actively used piece of the infrastructure, very critical piece of the infrastructure that really connects the US to Asia and also to Europe via connections through Chicago and so on and so forth. And so that's largely what I wanted to talk about, just to give you an update on why Pacificwave is important to CENIC and why we continue to participate in the operation of it, and also to try and identify some of the international partners that we're working with in addition to Mexico. Clearly a lot of interactions with Asia and also with Europe, although most of our Europe connections go through the East Coast, obviously, rather than the West Coast. Thanks.
Thank you, John. We have time for a question or two before cocktail hour. If anybody has a question for any of the panelists. I have 20 or 30 if you like. If you want me to get started, so you better ask a question. I just have, in that case, I just have one, and then we'll close. And it's analogous to the question that I asked of the panelists on the regional panel. I mean, John has been a part of CENIC, and Julio and Carlos have been longtime partners with CENIC. But as we look out on the horizon and we think about this international activity and international connectivity and partnerships, with Mexico, Central and South America, and I guess in the case of AmLite with the Caribbean as well, or with Asia, and more specifically Carlos with Mexico, what things should we be doing in the next year or two with regard to our international activity?
You two guys get to come up as well.
I guess one of the things that's happening, in terms of international connectivity is that somehow it's developing on the paths of least resistance. No, working with bands, we put a link, and that works for a while. I think at this point we collectively should look at a more permanent, long-term infrastructure for international connectivity and developing a set of rules, no, for how this should be funded, how can we optimize the collective burden of international connectivity, which now I believe it's extremely haphazard. No, I mean, I don't think there is we're not following a master plan of international connectivity for research networks. And I think there's an opportunity to think about that and really come up with some sort of an idea, try to develop the appropriate funding mechanisms for this to happen. I believe it's eventually will become critical for science to have this sort of infrastructure to be able to respond to all the science projects that are happening throughout the world. No, I mean the forecasted data growth is very important. As we were talking this morning about the archiving of data, no, the archiving of data should be an integral component of all the science networking that we're trying to do. And collectively, I think we should be aiming to have a global plan for this to happen. No, I mean, I think the time is right, no, and we should aim for have something of a long-term, more coherent, more agreed upon plan, no, for global connectivity.
Thank you. I think CENIC is doing a lot of the proper things. They've been doing that for many years. Evidence of that is the Pacificwave distributed exchange point, and the infrastructure that CENIC has along the West Coast that is used to transport a lot of the connections and data that come from international partners. I think continuing to evolve that, in particular with the exchange points, to scale up to the kinds of connections that the international partners will be bringing to the West Coast is going to be important to plan for that and to collaborate with your partners on that process. I also think that the world of virtualization for networking is emerging more and more. And the exchange points and the networks play a key role in being able to provide infrastructure for researchers that will be creating new forms of networks and dealing with, well, as far as operators such as CENIC and CUDI and also for Pacificwave, is to be able to start to work with that type of technology in a more production type basis. Today it's very experimental. They're just islands and projects, but at some point that may be developing more critical mass, and the network operators need to become comfortable with that. We're facing that phenomenon as well on the East Coast, going south to South America, looking at how we start to work more collaboratively and in a more coordinated fashion with the network operators serving the different networks in these regions. That's a significant challenge because there are different organizations, different practices, different cultures, and how do you harmonize your way of operating with other organizations?
I had a few comments, which is more coming from an institutional perspective. One of the things that I've been trying to do is just to collect some data, even at my own institution, about what kind of international collaborations we have, whether they're science or education-based. And it's really hard to do this at most institutions. Certainly it's difficult at my institution. There is no office that really, well, it's not quite true, but there isn't an office that effectively collects that information, because, as you know, researchers work with researchers and they don't necessarily tell anybody about what they're doing. it only surfaces when they have some kind of agreement that the university has to sign off on because there's some data sharing agreement, or there's a human subjects issue, or there's something that's likely to have some liability for the institution if they don't do it right. And so the things they know about are the ones where there's a formal collaboration in place that required some agreement to be drawn up. But so it's difficult to collect that information. And we have a couple of offices at my institution. One is a Global Initiatives Office, because USC is very interested in internationalizing its activities, both in research and education. And we have another one, which is the, sort of the research office, which everybody has. But neither one of those knows anything about networking. Okay, so they will understand perhaps a little bit about the scientific interactions they have, but they don't recognize that there are networking issues. And so I think we have a real opportunity to educate those communities. CENIC can do this. And we as individuals at the different universities need to educate our upper administration, particularly in the research domain, but also in the education domain, about what the challenges are. They have to understand a little bit about how international networking works, and what's important and what to consider. And so they only usually find out about it when they try to actually do something and it doesn't work, right? And it's either due to weak infrastructure in the other end, or weak infrastructure at our end, or they're trying to do it from a building that doesn't, unfortunately, still has Cat3 wiring in it, or whatever, right? But there's very little appreciation of what the issues are. So I think that's possibly something that CENIC could think about in helping to educate more about what the issues are, so we get more support, right, to do things better.
Thank you. Yes.
Actually, a question for Carlos. You made a comment that there's about 100,000 students that will be headed from Mexico to the United States higher ed. What's happening before higher ed? Can you speak to the primary school system in Mexico, and is there any plans for connectivity from a K-12 environment internationally?
Well, there is a plan to basically connect schools. They're talking about connecting 250,000 public buildings within the Peña Nieto government period, no? Which is basically 5 years to go. It's a huge number, no? The problem is, I mean, 2 years, well, year and a half has gone by, no, and there's no plan, no. I mean, you're not. I mean, there is the statement of a purpose to do it, but they're stuck on the specifics of how to do it. No, one of the things that Mexico is undertaking, a very major policy issue, is basically that they're going to use the 700 megahertz band for a public network. It's not going to be auctioned off to cellular providers. They want to create a wholesale network in the 700 megahertz band, which sounds, I don't know, correct until you have to deploy a certain number of cell sites and you don't have a single tower, and then you have to do deals with all the existing cell sites in order to be able to. So it becomes a horrendous, in my opinion, a horrendous nightmare of how to implement those good policy aims, no? But very little specifics, no? Eventually they'll solve them out, no? But right now my perception is that they're stuck in horrendous logistics problems, funding issues, no? Because, I mean, if you auction off spectrum, the government receives a whole lot of money and doesn't have to invest anything, no? The investment is done by the, no, here you have to invest yourself, no? And funding those investments in a situation in which the Mexican economy is not growing very much is going to be pretty hard, no? what I'm optimistic is that the declarations of purpose are there, no, which weren't there before. No? So I hope something happens. And what is important is that the certain areas that get connected can prove that you improve the educational results from connectivity, no? Which I think should be pretty easy, no? But I don't know, it's hard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you to all our guests this afternoon.